This is your daily dose of all things royal. Welcome back, my gorgeous, good-looking friends. So, folks, today I was deep in the trenches researching the defunding of Radio Free Europe for another epic censorship video I'm piecing together at the moment. But, as always, that dastardly duo and their corrupt schemes yanked me off track with another distraction. Clumsy me tripped headfirst into another rabbit hole I wish I had dodged. But I managed to climb my way out because this bombshell discovery has to hit the masses. Get ready for a video that is going to leave you stunned, maybe even fuming, especially if you're an American, and keep you glued to your screen till the very end. But before we unleash this new potential scandal, please do this kid a favor and hit that like button so we can spread this like wildfire. This is actually breaking news. So grab a snack, settle in, because this ride is going to be an absolute roller coaster. Here we go. I think by now, many of us realize that the last 2 weeks of Meghan posting nonsense and flooding the media space is all for distraction. Distraction away from not only Harry being caught on this Ring camera, but also the Bali scandal, as well as African parks. Hey, Meghan, maybe you can send some of your honey so these people don't have to be tortured. Just kidding on that one. I mean, there's just a lot of things that Harry and Meghan don't want you talking about at this moment. So what we've been seeing is this constant flood of PR puff pieces distracting all of us and giving us something else to talk about instead of the stuff that they don't want us talking about. Which is why I think we need to keep talking about the African Park scandal and keeping it in everybody's faces and pushing Meghan's face out of the way. 2 days ago, I reposted this from Queer Lips of Truth on X. He writes, as I listened to Secretary Marco Rubio's comments today about the fraud wherein only 12 cents of every dollar actually goes to charity and 88 cents are pocketed, I'm reminded that 2 African charities founded by or of which Prince Harry is patron have been in huge scandals. For those of you that don't know what he's talking about, he's referencing Secretary of State Marco Rubio in his testimony last week. Here is the clip.
I will say this, even with the reforms we put in place and what we're suggesting is changes to our foreign aid, we still will provide more foreign aid, more humanitarian support than the next 10 countries combined, than the entire OECD, and far more than China. China doesn't do humanitarian aid. China does predatory lending. That's what Belt and Road Initiative is. That's what all of their aid. They have zero record of doing humanitarian aid in the world. And frankly, they don't know how to do it. They have no interest in doing it. What they're very good at is going into some country, making you a loan, and then holding that debt over your head. And that's what they continue doing. By the way, you have to hire a Chinese company to do it. So I don't agree with this assessment that there's no evidence whatsoever that China has either the capacity or the will to replace the U.S. in humanitarian assistance, in food deliveries, or in developmental assistance for that matter. We provide development assistance. They provide debt traps. And that's a point over and over again around the world that we've made, and we found receptive audiences to it. Now look, anytime you undertake reforms of this magnitude that needed to be made, you're going to have hiccups and you're also going to have controversy. But these reforms had to happen. At USAID, 12 cents of every dollar was reaching the recipient. That means that in order for us to get aid to somebody, we had to spend all this other money supporting this foreign aid industrial complex. We're going to find more efficient ways to deliver aid to people directly, and it's going to be directed by our regional bureaus, and it's going to sponsor programs that make a difference, and it's going to be part of a holistic approach to our foreign policy. And I look forward to engaging with this committee and the appropriators as well, and ensuring that we get to the right place on that. My last point I would make, and this is something I am very proud of. I believe, and I'm not besmirching anyone else, but I believe that the approach we have taken at the State Department, and frankly at USAID, but at State Department, to move forward reforms that involved intake from all of our partners, that required input from people within the building. Many of the reforms we've made were driven by people inside the building, many of whom have worked there for 20 or 30 years. And now we are engaged with Congress, both in the House and Senate, in a comment period where we're taking many of your comments and are making changes to our organizational proposals that we look forward to bringing back to you with an official congressional notification. And even after that, there'll be an opportunity to move forward. But the State Department had to change. I'm telling you, it was no longer at the center of American foreign policy. It had often been replaced by the National Security Council or by some other agency of government, when in fact we have these highly talented people, many of whom have served in multiple posts around the world and have a holistic view of how foreign policy needs to be conducted, that were being edged out. Because you know what? When I get a decision memo early on at the State Department and they would hand me these memos, there were 40 boxes on this piece of paper. That means 40 people had to check off, yes, okay, before it even got to me. That's ridiculous. That takes too long. That's why people said, don't use State Department. They take too long and it's too cumbersome. And any one of those little boxes didn't get checked, the memo didn't move up the chain. That can't continue. We can't move at that pace in this world. Events happen quickly. And we have to be able to move at the pace of relevance. And so I hope to work with you in a productive way to make that possible. You're not going to like all the changes, but I want you to know what the intent of the changes are. It is not to dismantle American foreign policy, and it is not to withdraw us from the world. Because I just hit 18 countries in 18 weeks. That doesn't sound like much of a withdrawal. And I see some of these foreign ministers, including individuals from Ukraine, more than I've seen my own children. And I talk to them at least 3 times a week. We are engaged in the world, but we're going to be engaged in a world that makes sense and that's smart. And that isn't about saving money. It is about ensuring that we are delivering to our people what they deserve, a foreign policy that makes America stronger, safer, and more prosperous.
Which now brings us to talking about African parks and Harry's involvement with it. So one of the things that I want us for all to understand is that Harry wasn't a part of being a founder of this organization. Started back in the year of 2000 as a response to the dramatic decline of protected areas due to poor management and lack of funding. It says here, African Parks utilizes a clear business approach to conserving Africa's wildlife and remaining wild areas, securing vast landscapes, and carrying out the necessary activities needed to protect the parks and their wildlife. African Parks maintains a strong focus on economic development and poverty alleviation of surrounding communities to ensure that each park is ecologically, socially, and financially sustainable in the long term. What is important for everybody to understand here is that Harry was not with this organization from the beginning. He only joined it when he was with Meghan in 2016. Then in 2017, Harry becomes president of this organization. Mind you, he just joined in 2016. Now, if we stop and think and not be distracted by all the BS, because at that time, nobody asked the question, what qualifications did Harry have to deserve such a role? When asking ChatGPT to define the responsibilities of the president in African parks, this is what they had to say. The president of African Parks holds a pivotal leadership role overseeing the organization's strategic direction, financial integrity, and global partnerships. While the title president isn't commonly referenced in public materials, the responsibilities align closely with those of the CEO, currently Peter Fernhead. Financial responsibilities. The president is ultimately accountable for the financial health and sustainability of African parks. Key financial responsibilities include strategic financial oversight, donor engagement and compliance, financial reporting and transparency, risk management, and tasks with a global scope, managing over 49 million acres in partnership with governments and communities. The president engages with international stakeholders, including governments, philanthropists, and conservation organizations to foster partnerships and secure funding. Okay. Now, at the time in 2017, when this organization made Harry president of this organization, he was with Meghan. Did anyone stop and ask the question, hold on a second, does Harry have the qualifications to meet the requirements of being president of this global organization? No, he didn't, because by the time Harry became president in December of 2017, the whole world was distracted by Harry and Meghan and their engagement, as well as Meghan flooding and saturating the media space everywhere with her damn face. And I believe, after what I've discovered today, that it was purely intentional that this flew under the radar. So let this part register. Prince Harry was president of African Parks for 5 years and 4 months before he suddenly transitioned into becoming a board member in April of 2023. Now, some suspect that the reason why Harry made this sudden change into becoming a board member was because of this scandal that was brewing with the Baka people. I think that's part of it, but I don't think that's all of it. Here is what I found. Set up just like Sent to Bali, African Parks Foundation also has a nonprofit entity set up here called African Parks Foundation of America. Let's take a look at their financial history starting in 2011, as I believe that's when the nonprofit was set up here in the United States. No surprises here. In 2011, you can see that it was humble beginnings with gross revenue of $615,100, with net revenue, which is expenses minus the gross revenue, to be $45,740. That's the first year of this nonprofit here in the United States. Now, what we see here for the first 5 years this nonprofit was opened here in the United States is healthy growth. After expenses are taken out, they're still in the positive, as you can see. Now, keep in mind that up until July of 2016, Prince Harry was not involved with this organization. But here we see early signs of a dip in gross revenue. Not saying that it's related to Harry joining on and him just starting to date Meghan, but I think it's important that we pay attention to that because in 2017, African Parks goes ahead and makes Prince Harry president. And what do we see next? A lot of fugazery. Now, remember I had said that technically the role of president holds ultimate accountability for the financial health and sustainability of the organization. They are supposed to work in parallel with the CEO who executes the day-to-day functions and manages the operations. To help you better understand, think about Sophie Chandoka's role. She is the one who's ultimately responsible for the finances of Sent to Bali, but she works in parallel with her CEO, who is responsible for the daily execution and operations of the organization. They work hand in hand. It's the same thing here between the president and the CEO of African Parks. Or at least that's how it's supposed to work. So now when you look at these numbers, they jump out at you because during the time that Harry was president, you can see that they had been in the red when it came to spending more than what they were bringing in, except when it came to 2020. You can see outlined in green, African Parks had this sudden injection of over $100 million. And this is just for the nonprofit set up here in the United States. This doesn't cover the other donations and government funding that's going towards the rest of the world. Now, let me show you why this is so shady. Now, when you go back and you look at all the African Parks 990s, and we'll start with the most recent one in 2023. The filing shows for contributions and grants on the front page as $50,350,827. And when you go to Section A of Public Support, that is supposed to match up with the corresponding year in showing the historicals. So as you can see in column E for 2023, the amount of gifts, grants, contributions, and membership fees received, it totals $50,350,827. Going backwards for year 2022, it's the same thing. As you can see, grants, gifts, contributions total $22,690,624. You can see column E, year 2022, they match. The exact same protocol is followed in 2021 with totals of gifts, grants, contributions equaling $16,529,571. Are we good so far? But now, when we look at 2020, the numbers don't match. As you can see, the total amount for contributions and grants for the year 2020 totaled $118,750,649. Now, when you go to column E, where it says 2020, you're seeing reflecting $18,750,649,000. Now, what they did here was extremely deceitful because they could come back and say, oopsie, We just made an error and forgot to add the extra one. Because if you notice, the numbers are exactly the same, aside from the extra one, making it 118 million instead of 18 million. You see what I'm saying? Now, for those that are so gracious and trusting, you could give the benefit of the doubt, but this was not a mistake. And I'll tell you why for two reasons. The first reason is all throughout this document, they have listed the total amount of grant money that they receive, which it's showing 118 million and so forth. Whoever's responsible for filling out this form knows very well that they're leaving out $100 million, hoping that nobody's going to catch it, which nobody did catch it until now, 5 years later. It appears to me that they didn't want to draw any attention to this large sum of money that was injected into this organization. And this was done to avoid people scrutinizing where this money came from. Before we talk about where it didn't come from, I need to explain to you why this is a serious matter. If we go back to the most recent 990 from 2023, you can see here with the historicals, they never corrected this. So what that means, every subsequent year starts from the wrong baseline. Even if revenue and expenses are correctly reported year to year, the cumulative assets of the organization appear tens of millions lower than they actually are, which in turn misleads the stakeholders about the nonprofit's financial health, reserves, and spending capacity. Now, why do we care? Well, this is a public charity, and if they are soliciting donations from the public, then of course you want to know that your hard-earned money is going towards the actual cause itself, not being siphoned away, which appears to be the case in this situation from what I see. Now, I'm not a tax professional. Somebody would have to actually look at it like the IRS to see where the rest of this money is allocated, because it's not showing up in the subsequent reports. And then when you take into consideration the subsequent years after 2020, the organization in the United States was spending more than it was bringing in, especially since it was during the time of COVID when the whole world was at a standstill. What exactly were they spending money on here in the United States? Especially since the main function of the arm here in the United States is for fundraising. So what do these numbers and timing of Harry becoming president of this organization tell you? So now the next logical question that I think many of us are probably wondering is, where did this injection of cash come from the year that Harry and Meghan decided to Megxit? More than likely, it came from the U.S. taxpayer via these various funds and trusts. However, back in 2020, none of us really knew where to look to see if there was like one donation that was made. Now, one of the things that I want to bring up is who didn't give this money in 2020. I remember back in September of 2021 when African Parks announced that the Walton family was pledging $100 million. Now, it wasn't $100 million up front, it was $100 million over the course of several years. So this money that we're seeing in 2020 is not the Waltons' $100 million pledge. Like, I do remember people talking about this because many of us were saying the Waltons, like one of the richest families here in the United States, just gave $100 million or pledged $100 million to Harry's charity. Like, why? And I remember that Harry and Meghan took full advantage of this announcement through their Sussex squad, associating themselves with this powerful and rich family. And this was a time when Meghan and Harry still had some level of popularity here in the United States. I mean, during that time, Meghan and Harry were on their way to New York City to do their first fake royal tour. Anyhow, I digress. The money didn't come from the Waltons, although I wouldn't put it past these two. If there is something shady going on here with missing millions, then they possibly had put that out there in order to make sure that the stories jive, right? So if $100 million was injected into this organization, they're going to have to come up with some story. And given the fact that they have distracted us on so many levels, nobody really was paying attention to any of this until now. But I can tell you that the Waltons made good on their promise, and they had been donating in batches of 20 million, 30 million over the last several years. So yes, that money is accountable. What's really peculiar, though, is before Harry showed up and the organization was trending upwards and being profitable, Nicole Molo was the executive director, secretary, treasurer of this little unit here in the United States of African Parks, growing the business. She was the one who launched and built the U.S. operations for African Parks and was with the company for 4 years and 7 months. Then, when Harry came onto the scene in July of 2016, Nicole, a few months later, ends up leaving. And Tony Condon comes in to take her place with over 20 years of experience in development and fundraising management. Now, I did try to look around online to see if I could find additional information about this woman, but unfortunately, there's not much out there about her aside from the work that she has done with African Parks as well as other philanthropies and fundraising activities and securing grants. That's about it. So I really don't know if she's capable of scandal. However, what's interesting is that her and Harry decide to exit stage left approximately at the same time in 2023. And finally, the last point that I would like to make on this topic before I move into the next one is that I did search high and low to see where this money came from. I even went through all the annual reports, including the 2020, and the closest that I've come up with is seeing this. An additional capital of $45.3 million was injected into the African Parks Endowment Fund in 2020, bringing the total capital balance as at December 31st, 2020 to $84 million US dollars. The fund is invested in a mix of equity, bonds, and cash according to the investment policy set out by our funding committee. The endowment fund assets are held on the balance sheets of Stitching African Parks Foundation in the Netherlands and African Parks Foundation of America, both affiliated entities of African Parks Network. Now, this just became that much more dodgy. Let's say, okay, part of the injection of cash came from this endowment fund that's from the Netherlands. That is part of African Parks. Essentially, what we're doing here is just shifting money around. But that doesn't explain the rest of the money. So if you injected $45 million in 2020, and the account did over $100 million. And we know that it's approximately $12 to $13 million a year from other donations. Then that leaves almost $30 million that has come from where? Where did the rest of that money come from? The bottom line is, no matter how you slice it, the reporting here in the United States is wrong. And I don't think for a second that that was a mistake, especially with Prince Harry at the wheel as president during this time. Again, I go back to saying, why did they bring Harry on board to become president of this organization when he spent less than a year working with them? Makes no sense unless he was being used for something. Let's go ahead and switch gears for a quick second. Chris Coons, Democrat, World Economic Forum darling globalist. All I can say is birds of a feather definitely flock together. One could say that Harry and Senator Coons have developed a strong friendship over the last couple of years, bonding over, for the most part, wildlife and conservation. Both have a lot in common when it comes to censorship, Ukraine war, and pushing policies to fatten their wallets. 8 months ago, I exposed this off-the-record retreat that Senator Coons attended, in which Harry was one of the hosts, all in the name of discussing policy, conservation, and wildlife. Several months later, in December of 2022, Senator Coons introduces a new bipartisan bill pertaining to creation of this U.S. Foundation for International Conservation. So essentially what Senator Coons is doing here is pretty much setting up another USAID type environment where you have government entity that is an actual foundation that will get funds directly from the government to then shell out to NGOs like African Parks. You see how this works? And this engine that's being set up will take care of international conservation and wildlife, otherwise known as green colonialism, exactly what we're seeing African Parks do to the indigenous people on their land. Now let's get into that. Now, I'm going to tell you why Harry is not going to say anything. It's because under Harry's watch as president, this was going on and he knew about it. Not just the African Park staff telling him or Survival International telling him, it's because the US government was telling him. And let me show you. This is the next part of this bombshell video. Under the Biden administration, Harry's African Parks was given millions through US aid to a tune of $43.6 million. You see, what people don't know and has not been reported on is that the Government of Accountability Office have been alleging that the existence and management of conservation areas have detrimental effects on the self-determination and livelihoods of locals and indigenous peoples. Exactly what's going on with the Baka people. Even though this report and findings came out in July of 2024, understand that the work that was put into putting this together had been going on since 2020. Let me read to you the intro to this report, dated on July 23rd, 2024, addressed to the Honorable Bruce Westerman, Chairman, the Honorable Raul M. Grijalva, Ranking Member. So this is part of the Committee on Natural Resources, House of Representatives. Now, I'm going to take a look and see if there was a hearing last year, because I'd be interested to hearing what they had to say about the indigenous people, and I'll get back to you on that. But for our purposes here, they write, wildlife trafficking, the illegal trade and poaching of wild animals, is a serious transnational crime that threatens security, economic prosperity, the rule of law, long-standing conservation efforts, and human health, according to the Department of State. The U.S. government has supported efforts to combat wildlife trafficking and protect biodiversity around the world through a range of activities implemented by federal agencies in cooperation with partner organizations in the field, like African Parks. These activities include support from the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, the Department of the Interior's U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, FWS, and state bureaus of international narcotics and law enforcement affairs for park rangers and anti-poaching units that work to protect wildlife in parks and protected areas. Some sources allege that the existence and management of conservation areas have detrimental effects on the self-determination and livelihoods of locals and indigenous peoples. Conflict between people and wildlife over crops, livestock, grazing land, or human safety may also contribute to poaching. In addition, in some parks and protected areas, ongoing civil conflict and the presence of armed groups present a risk to park rangers, as well as local communities and indigenous peoples. According to international and non-governmental organization NGO reporting, an estimated 150 park rangers are killed in the line of duty worldwide each year. However, in recent years, NGO and media reports have raised concerns and alleged that partner organizations funded by the U.S. government have played a role in training and equipping forces who subsequently committed a range of human rights violations, including sexual assault and extrajudicial killings. Among the victims of these alleged abuses are local communities and indigenous peoples living near protected areas in Africa and Asia. In our prior work in October of 2020, we examined the agency's mechanisms to prevent U.S.-funded efforts to combat wildlife trafficking from supporting human rights abuses. And that makes total sense. Like, taxpayers do not want to be contributing to the pain and suffering that is going on, especially like what is going on with the Baka people. So essentially what this office does is hold these various agencies accountable to make sure that our money is not being spent recklessly and contributing towards pain and suffering of this world, which is what they are hearing on the street with all these complaints that are coming into them about the raping, the beating, the stealing of land, as well as the poaching. Now, I'm going to go ahead and put the link to the full report if you're interested in reading the full 86-page document. But I'm going to go ahead and pull out a couple sections here because they do call out African parks, and it's pretty bad. And just remember, folks, this was in the window of time that Harry was president. Anyway, on the U.S. side, our action items were getting our agencies to get these partners to put together and put in place these safeguards to protect human rights in exchange for the money. So essentially, they say here, USAID, FWS, and state have taken steps to ensure partners plan for social safeguards to protect human rights in ranger activities for selected awards. But their efforts have weaknesses that could present human rights abuse risks for projects. Specifically, while USAID required implementing partners to provide plans for social safeguards, it did not ensure timely completion of the plans. In addition, FWS conducts a risk assessment addressing human rights risks and social safeguards for applicants for awards with ranger activities under its abuse of power pilot. However, FWS has not communicated guidance for applicants to provide quality, timely information to FWS regarding human rights abuse risks related to the project and any planned social safeguard mechanisms to address those risks. Moreover, it goes on to say in the next paragraph, USAID required partners to provide plans addressing social safeguards to protect human rights, including community consultation and engagement, consideration of indigenous peoples, and FPIC principles, if applicable, human rights training for rangers, and GRM. However, USAID did not ensure timely completion of the plans based on the timeframes USAID set for the awards. This raises the risk that USAID does not have sufficient timely information to determine if its partners have planned appropriate human rights safeguards. Federal internal control standards state that management should design appropriate types of control activities to achieve objectives and respond to risks, and that common activities include comparisons of actual performance to plans. They also state that management should use quality information that is appropriate, current, complete, accurate, accessible, and provided on a timely basis. So now part of this report included a sample of 7 awards that USAID had worked with partners to establish requirements and timeframes to get together these social safeguard plans to protect the people in the projects that they were executing that they needed this money for. Well, in any case, USAID had set timelines around or parameters as to when this was due in order to get funding. And here we have African parks not being compliant. As you can see, USAID had established a date of September 2022. And when did they provide those plans? May 2023 and June of 2023. The thing that makes me so angry about this is that they still went ahead and gave funding despite not having these safeguard plans in place to protect the people. As you can see here, this contract was for $17 million. And all through the course of Harry's presidency, USAID had been cutting checks. And that's not the only contract. But even more infuriating is that money that was given to African parks, some of it was supposed to be helping and protecting these people. That's the thing that pisses me off the most, when you know that the money is not getting to the people. The money is not helping these people. But even though we are giving money to specifically help this situation, what's so infuriating about this $17 million contract was that it was originally $2 million. So not only under the Biden administration, it was extended after it expired from 2021 to 2024 and got an increase of 750%. And what really grinds my gears here is knowing that Harry was in charge of this organization as president for the window of time that this money had been doled out. And I would like to know if he lined his pockets with it. Because if he has, I don't know, I think the American people should go after and sue him. So this program, called Central Africa Regional Program for the Environment, otherwise known as CARP, was set up in June 2012 with parameters pertaining to human rights abuses of the indigenous people, in addition to how to capacity build and protect the wildlife and so forth. But this was the structure established way back when. So what this means essentially is any U.S. taxpayer money that's going towards this program called CARP, which is what African Parks is participating in, has funds built in to be given to help the indigenous people, to make sure that their whole ecosystem is not disrupted by these greedy globalists. But it doesn't sound like that's happening. It sounds like these people are being forced off their land. They are being beaten. They're being abused, all because of this green colonialism. These people are so disgusting, and Harry needs to be held to account because this was all going on in the window of time when he was president of African Parks. The Biden administration didn't care about human rights. They stole the U.S. taxpayer money. Clearly, you're seeing it play out here with African Parks, and it's such a shame that none of this money really went to help alleviate the suffering that's going on. USA didn't do their fucking job. It seriously was like a fire sale for the last government, because when you look at this other contract for $10 million, it had expired in 2023 and they extended it, giving it an increase of 567% from 1.5 million to 10 million. And I'm willing to bet that there's a high probability that Senator Chris Coons had helped get these contracts extended, as well as increased to such an enormous percentage. Disgusting. So now that African Parks has been exposed on a global level, along with USAID for not doing anything, they are now in cover your ass mode with all these proposals being uploaded to the system to beg for money. Uploaded in December of 2024, an update to the CARP program. We've got CARP version 4, Gender and Social Inclusion Analysis. Well, isn't that something? Now they want to talk about the human rights abuses, as well as those safeguard plans to be put in place after the Government Accountability Office had put them on blast. Well, unfortunately, it's too late, because Doge now has seen the third contract in which they were begging for $10 million and canceled it. It's unfortunate because apparently this money now was going to be allocated to focusing on protecting the indigenous people. But you know what? It's not my problem. And don't dare blame Donald Trump for making the necessary termination, because African Parks had more than enough money to help these people and chose not to. So the bigger question is, what did they do with that money? And on top of it, Harry, what did you do with the rest of the millions that came in 2020? Inquiring minds would like to know. I don't know, Harry. It's not looking so good for you. Between African Parks and Santa Bali, interfering with the 2020 election, funding and supporting a terrorist group called the Sussex Squad, and then the cherry on top. I don't know, Harry. It's not looking so good for you. Between African Parks and the problems there, and then Santa Bali and the problems over there, then you have interfering with the 2020 election and censoring Americans online, as well as funding and supporting a domestic terrorist group called the Sussex Squad, and then the cherry on top, knowing about January 6th. I'm telling you, Megan's bump is the least of your worries right now. The least. I'm surprised you're not sharing a cell right now with Diddy. That's just my opinion. Anyhow, what do you guys think? Definitely leave your thoughts below. As always, I will be back with more content. But until then, please be safe, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.
Such a fraud.